Hello, everybody. Welcome to the talk on Mondays, Stories Behind the Headlines. I'm talking about climate today because the COP26 is due in November at Glasgow, one of the most important meetings that the countries can come together and decide on action plan. COP stands for Conference of Parties, and there are 26 of them, which are 26 countries. Now, as you know, climate is a very important thing because we see, and science has proved it time and again, that our environment is impacted. The emissions that are resulting from the fossil fuels, especially, are warming the planet. And when you have a warming of the planet, all sorts of things happen. And as you know, the polar caps are sort of melting, and a lot of fires all over the world in various places, and droughts and flooding in others. As the temperature sort of increases, there's going to be more drastic sort of effect or impact on the world. So it's very important for us to know what is happening. So let's get on with it. Our topic for today is this, and what are we going to be covering? So we'll see who the COP people are. And of course, we are looking at countries which have taken interest in the emissions that are coming from the industrialized countries mostly. The poorer countries, the countries of the South, are probably not big contributors at the moment. But the industrialized countries are the ones that are doing the most damage to the environment. So let's look at home what's happening, UK situation, and what sort of damage to the environment that is taking place, and what the aspirations of the government are, and also whether those aspirations are going to be delivered in some way. Because it's very easy to be able to make promises and so on, but very hard to be able to deliver. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the US and, of course, the Trump pullout from the Paris Agreement 4 years ago, and we lost 4 years. So the world is really that much poorer in terms of action towards climate. So we'll see now that Biden has joined, what sort of action plan is being put in place. So he's returned, and the immediate thing that he's embarking on is to bring in some plans which will facilitate the transition to the healthier environment or carbon-free environment. It's not going to happen overnight, but at least a start needs to be made. And incentives of the government need to be there to be able to have that come about. And we can also see about China. China is one of the biggest polluters in the world, along with USA. These two countries make up half the pollution in the world, and they are responsible for practically half the GDP of the world together. So we'll see just about what they are doing. And then, of course, EU targets as well. Because since Ursula von der Leyen came in, one of the first things she did was to bring about a green type of legislation, which is helping a lot of countries, and that's a very good start to do to try and tackle the climate issues. Okay, let's get on with it. What is COP? In its simplest form, COP is an annual event from where world leaders come together to agree a collective action plan and to set targets that can be enforced fairly in the global fight against climate change. So that's simply putting in what they plan to do as a group. Now, it's important to remember that gathering of countries and agreeing on something is an effective way of solving the problem, because the problem is global. No one country can sort of solve it. As we know from the old sort of climate problems that we had, you remember the ozone layer that was getting bigger and bigger. And then the countries got together in the late 80s, I think, and early 90s, and they said they banned what was called CFCs. CFCs were the chlorofluorocarbons, which were the ones that were going into the atmosphere and knocking off the ozone layer, which is the oxygen layer that's surrounds the world, the Earth. Now, it's interesting to know that this ozone layer protects the species and life on Earth because it stops the radiation coming in and damaging life as a whole. And it is, in fact, a very thin film of layer of ozone, which gets damaged, and therefore that hole starts to appear. Now, when they banned the CFCs, of course, they the result was that this big ozone layer started to contract. So maybe by 2050, that's still another few decades on, it would be completely restored. So you can see, gathering of countries agreeing on something, banning the CFCs, they stop that damage taking place to the environment and saving, life and species on Earth. The earliest thing is 1995. The first COP was held in Berlin. And since then, the urgency for action against climate change has grown in importance. So you can see already about 25 years ago, people started to take it seriously, which is right after the conference of the CFCs that stopped the ozone layer. So here it is, again, a good basis to start doing something worthwhile. Now, the last one we remember took place in Paris, and that was the time when Obama and Xi Jinping really got together and spoke the same language. And of course, the industrialized countries were there as well, Germany, France, England. And they then said, fine, let's go and take some action and bring in some targets. And the targets that they came up with was to try and retain hope. So the goal is to keep the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5. So the lower sort of temperature rise, the better. But these targets, of course, they seem very small, but in fact, they are very, very sort of powerful in terms of impacting the global sort of climate. So what they have to do is to try and, so at the Paris Agreement, there was that move towards taking some action. But then what happened was that Trump came in 2016 and decided to pull USA out. So immediately what happened then was that people lost a little bit of heart and direction and leadership. And they were floundering. So there was all sorts of backward step being taken, especially in USA. Although I must say in USA, although the federal government comes up with these rather ridiculous type of denials that, that the climate change is happening because of CO2 emissions, the states themselves do recognize that as a fact, and they need to do something, and they have implemented. California and other places like that, they have implemented some very good sort of policies towards change and decarbonizing. So there we are. That's the same thing. I'll show a picture later on. Here we are. So what is the importance about the 1.5 degrees rise? So here we are. When we talk about the 1.5 rise, we are talking about an average temperature above pre-industrial levels. Now, when we talk about averages, we can't say any particular city has a certain temperature. It's a global, if you like. And they have ways of methods of calculating that. And globally, it's the 1.5 rise that one is concerned about. So as of 2017, the number is calculated to be between 0.8 centigrade and 1.2 centigrade. So if you start using 2070 as our as a starting point. Now, one thing we need to mention over here is that, industrialization took place here, a couple of 100 years ago. And before that, it was the agricultural economy. So pollution and in terms of, global warming, it wasn't there. It's only when the industrialization came about, industries expanded, that fossil fuels started to burn, coal in particular. That was the one that started to make the difference. So anyway, if you take the starting point here as 2017, so the number is to be rising, is calculated to be between this 8.8 and 1.2. And it's rising between 0.1 centigrade and 0.2 every 10 years. So you can see this change has already started to make itself felt. It's going at a rapid pace. Every 10 years is putting on 0.2 degrees centigrade, which means we are only a decade or two away from the 1.5 centigrade increase. If we don't act now, we are going to have that rise and maybe even further rise taking place. Now, this is the impact that one will be seeing if this, let me make that a bit bigger. Now, what these four maps are saying is that this is a change. If we have a change of 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures, on a hottest day, what we can expect to see is the increase of between 2 to 3 degrees here. If you see that dark, in fact, 2 to 4 degrees. So these areas of the world are going to be impacted to that point of having a change of up to 4 degrees. And if we assume that the increase is going to be 2 degrees or more, then you see large tracts of the world are going to be having this type of increase, 4 to 5 degrees here. Temperatures, the dark areas. Now, it's the equivalent for the winter here. This is the summer, which is the hotter sort of side of things. And in the colder sort of months, what it's saying is that the impact is going to be even more severe because you can see these dark areas, we are going to have an increase of 8 to 10 degrees. So when we talk about a 1.5 or 2 degrees increase in global temperatures, in fact, what it results is this amount of change. In the winters, you can see it's 8 to 10 degrees, which is why the polar caps are sort of melting, and we're going to have all sorts of issues. So that's just really a broad sort of picture as to what this 1.5 to 2 would mean to the world. So countries have yet to finalize the rules on how the Paris Agreement will operate going forward, and COP26 will allow countries to complete the job. So here we haven't come down to specific action that the countries have to take. So this is why this conference is so important. At that conference, there'll be a lot of bargaining done, because what is really the issue here is that the poor countries, they're not contributing too much to the global warming. And yet what is happening is that they're being told that they should change their energy sources and cut down on the emission. Now they're saying that's an expensive business for us. It's far easier for us to just dig up the coal and use it for energy for our development. Now, the richer countries are saying, look, this is going to damage the whole world. So what the poor countries are saying is, okay, fine, if you help us financially, we'll try and do something to mitigate that. So that's where this sort of big, if you like, conference is going to come down to. How much can the rich countries give to the poor countries to change over, and whether that's sufficient for them to agree to be able to change their plans. So that's what the issue is. Well, one other thing I think we also need to mention is that we talk about how we individually have to make an effort, like switching off the lights and maybe having one shower a week or 2 showers at most, and not a daily one. Those sort of little things we can do, and maybe not use so much paper. Cut down trees and so on. So really, we can do something at the individual level. But Mark Carney, if you remember, he was the Bank of England governor, and he retired, I think, a couple of years back. But before he retired, he sort of made a statement which was very important. He says it's good to be able to ask the people to do something, to cut down on the emissions and so on. But it's far more important to be able to ask the industry to do it. Why industry? Because industry is the one that calls the shots in a big way. They are the biggest users of energy and so on and so forth. So what Mark Carney was saying was that these companies should be asked to look at their very survival as time progresses with warming taking place. If the sustainability of their business is not there because of climate change, then they're going to go under. So if that threat is there, the companies are going to start shifting their stance and change over and be able to get maybe policies in that will cut down on the carbon emissions in a big way. So that was a very important. And he's going to be there at the COP26 as well. So COP26 will be the big summit the UK has ever held, with many describing it as the most significant climate change summit of all time. Now, this is important because we've seen, started in 1995, 2015, it slowed down, although there was a fair amount of coming together in policy making. But then this actual specifics as to what action should be taken by each country and be put into their plans of development, that is the thing that we need to do. So supporting COP20 demonstrates that we are investing in the success of the conference and its outcomes, and our participation reinforces our absolute commitment to tackling climate change. So that means that we are committed. And it's important that we show commitment to it in terms of action plans. Now, this is Scottish Power, because it's going to be taking place in Glasgow. And they're saying we're committed to playing our part in this journey and plan to invest 10 billion in the clean energy generation. And networks and infrastructure need to be helped the UK decarbonize. So they are saying we believe in developing an energy model that prioritizes the well-being of people and the preservation of the planet. So all very good intention, but they're also backing it with some money. So that's very heartening to know. Now, we should consider this to be as an emergency. We've got to embark on at an emergency footing. And I think because delay means it'll be innumerably more expensive. Because if you're shy of spending a little bit of money now, then we're going to spend 10 to 100 times more later on if we don't take any action. Now, what are UK's plans? The UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries on earth. We rank bottom among the G7 countries when it comes to the loss of species. Now, that's a sort of news to me. I didn't know that, but here it is, and we have that information being sort of given to us by our media over here. Like examples, these are puffin lands and kittiwakes, and you can see that are now both in danger of extinction. Now, I'm showing this to show the sort of ground reality in UK. Because, when we talk about these 1.5% changes and so on and so, it doesn't really, get into our minds. But when we see real sort of life and, the terrain, then we are able to sort of visualize as to what that means. So these birds are in danger of extinction since the Paris Agreement, but this is just one example of a degraded ecosystem and global failure to bring us back to the climate. See, here it looks like it's steaming, but the climate crisis is warming these waters, pushing away the fish these birds depend on. So what happens is that global warming means that the fish go further into the sea. These birds can't go and get their food, or they start to sort of reduce in numbers. Now, this is the Channel 4 news saying that 80,000 seabirds come ashore to this place to breed, and there are 40,000 puffins there, each in the place of a quarter of. Even in this place, a quarter of the bird species are threatened across the UK as a whole. 1 in 7 bird species now endangered. So you can see this is the reality that we need to focus. There is the real cost already happening. Is warming these waters, pushing further away the fish these birds depend on. This is puffins, by the way. Kittiwakes are now both in danger of extinction. Now, he's one of the experts over here, and he's saying that this window is closing very fast, the time that we've got. To show the global leadership, there's still time for the UK government, actions towards the world. Now, they've got to be able to start taking action, not just saying words, but actions. And we'll see what that means as we go on. And he's saying further, this is probably the most important coming together of nations ever. Now, that's a pretty strong statement to make. And it's important to make these strong statements because sometimes, we don't really see how important these things are. Now, these are the contributions by sector of emissions, 24%, 18, 19%. And this is the various things, like, for instance, here, there's transport, agriculture, and so on. A bit more detail as we go along here. Okay. Now, the government has come out with something called the Green Revolution. Yeah, the Conservative government. But the problem is that while they're saying we are for the Green Revolution, they, in actual fact, are doing the opposite here. They're building more on roads. Of course, that means more pollution. It exports as more pollution again here. And this green homes grant scrapped, which means that any subsidy that they give for improving homes for whatever, insulation and what have you. So that has been scrapped. So you can see policy could be one thing, it's easy to make, but to try and deliver on that is difficult because all these sort of things get in the way. And we need to be able to try and be sure that we do follow through on the green thing. So now this is saying basically that is when we talk about climate, it's not just temperatures we're talking about. It means the impact of nature. As I said, the birds are going to be affected, the species are going to be affected. So we've got to realize there's a big connection between the climate and the nature. So much more than just climate is about dealing with the entire catastrophe upon nature. Indeed, the UK is one of the most nature. Okay, we've said that. They're at the bottom of the G7 countries. But now he's the business secretary, and he's also sort of saying, the sound bites. Yeah, we're green and we want to do everything, but then of course, the actions are not necessarily green. So here is the action aspirations of the UK. It's the first country to introduce a Climate Change Act in 2018, that's 3 years ago. UK committed to one of the world's most ambitious targets to cut emissions by 78% by 2035. Fantastic. Now what we need to do is to be able to sort of say, how are we going to be able to reach that? So here we are. What instead we are doing is what I just said. We are not following through with that thing to see how we can, because surface transport is contributing. Now, it says now the biggest emitter before the pandemic blip. It's made up of 20% of our emissions, barely moving over the last decade. So this 3 years ago, when the act came about, one would have thought that this percentage would go down, but in the last decade, this hasn't changed. And the building sector also hasn't changed much. It's relatively flat at 18%. And in agriculture, no progress there either. So 3 years ago, the act came about, and yet these statistics tell us that no real significant impact has taken place. So basically, Johnson's plans are a bit contradictory. Everywhere contradiction to Boris quoted Green Revolution. So these are the ones I mentioned: the airports, the building of roads, and sea exploration for gas, and cutting down, scrapping the insulation thing, and also going in for development of new coal mine in Cumbria over there. And of course, coal is very, very polluting. So really, it's not the green revolution that we've been promised. So UK needs to take action, show leadership at COP26. So COP26 is the chance where UK can make a difference. Back up our words of action that we do over the next 5 years. And will probably determine the future of humanity for the next millennium. Millennium means 1,000 years. So actually, it's a very important type of opportunity for UK to show some real good leadership in there. Now, US coming back into the climate, the Paris Agreement is a very good sign. So the US is back in the global fight against climate. On the first day of office, the president signed an executive order to rejoin the Paris Agreement. So that was very heartening when Biden came in. He did something very positive. Now, support for developing countries, big issue, particularly for vulnerable countries in terms of getting finance, public finance, but also private finance. Now, Kani, remember I told you, he wants to get these big companies starting to think green. And therefore, finances and institutions are very important as to how they fund some of the projects and whether they give funds freely for that or sort of hold back on the more polluting type of industries. So the vulnerable countries, the figure of 100 billion a year has been committed by developed countries. So as I told you earlier on, the poor countries said that we need some help to be able to change over from coal to other sort of sources. So like for instance, if coal is going to be not the option, then you have to put, solar panels, and especially in hot countries, solar panels can deliver a lot of energy. Because nowadays, the alternative green energy is proving to be as good or even less costly than the fossil fuels. So there is a big incentive now to change over. So there's an inducement of that money. But that money hasn't really become available. And I think because of the pandemic getting in the way. So how will Biden's new infrastructure plan help to stop? Okay, so his plan, what is his plan? Key goals of Biden include net zero carbon emissions. So at least the vision is carbon-free electricity production by 2035. Remember I said earlier on, the UK by 2035 was cut down by 78% of the carbon. And net zero, which means no carbon at all, by 2050. So these are very good sort of ideas, plans. Let's see if that can be achieved. Okay, so this is really the Biden plan will make a historic investment in clean energy, future, and environmental justice, paid for by rolling back the Trump tax incentives. When Trump came in, he enriched the corporation by giving them, lowering the taxes. So a lot of rich people got richer, but at the expense of the environment. So he really sold out on that. Now, the specifics of Biden's plans for the EVs, that's electric vehicles. Now, I talked about these electric vehicles under Tesla, a few times in my talks before. Now, that's one good sort of glimmer of light, as it were. Technology is going to deliver the goods that are required. And batteries coming in, electric vehicles coming in a big way will save a lot of carbon being issued by these vehicles on the roads. So transport is going to be greatly helped. So here he's got 174 billion dedicated to electric vehicles, including electric vehicles charging infrastructure. Now, once you've got the batteries in the car, that they need to be charged every now and then. And you need to have the charging stations. Now, we already in Camden have some of these stations. If you look around on the pavement, you've got these little sort of stubs of things sticking out, and you can put your, the wires in the plug and get your vehicles charged. But you need to have many, many more of those. And he's planning to have 500,000 new charging stations by 2030. And of course, electric buses and fleets, converting the federal government fleet of vehicles to EVs, 35 billion to developing technology addressing the climate crisis. So he's putting some funds well behind it. And the idea is, of course, to be able to facilitate the move away from fossil fuels to this green energy, which can come from solar or from hydropower or wind, and be able to be stored in batteries, because that is the problem, you see, with this green energy. You need to have it stored for the time that you need. So once the batteries are available, then of course it becomes very feasible for its utilization at all times. Now, these are details of what his $2 trillion infrastructure plan is, and this is to do with the EVs and green energies. And this is the other stuff, because infrastructure, besides just these charging stations, you got to be able to have, because if you've got lots of holes on the road, then you're going to utilize a lot of this energy and inefficient cars. So you need to be able to provide better infrastructure all right, but with a particular focus for electric vehicles, which is what he's trying to do now. Now, here is experts say that the US wants to avert climate disaster and must join China. So these are the two countries that will make the biggest difference in adopting a net zero emission target. A number of other nations, including UK, France, New Zealand, have already made such a pledge. That means 3/5 of global CO2 emission would be covered. So if you take the industrialized countries and get them committed to sort of doing something about it, then I think this can be reduced considerably. This is really the only way that we are going to be able to have a chance to avoiding the most catastrophic impact of climate change throughout the world. So here it is, that time and again, the warning. Now, when Obama was there, and just before the 2015 Paris Agreement, these are two people that said, yeah, let's go together. And because they agreed, they twisted the arms and gave inducements as well to a lot of poor countries in the Paris Agreement, and the agreement was done. But then the moment he went and Trump came in, it fell back. These are the countries also agreeing at that meeting to abide by certain rules. Now, China is saying, UN, that China will be carbon neutral within 4 decades. So by 2016, strengthening it. So it basically means, you remember net zero carbon, we said 2050, the promise by USA and maybe by UK as well. So China is also saying we'll do it by 2060. Now, I'm pretty sure that when they say 2060, they will do it, because they have a form of government and they have these plans which they deliver on. And we've seen in the last 5 decades, they have really sort of done a miraculous change in China. And the poor people are now much better off, 800 million of them out of poverty. So they're able to deliver. And when they say 2060, I think very easily it's believable. Problem is that when we say it's 2050 here and in USA, the various governments, they put different emphasis on different types of dates. And also the funds necessary. So we can't be sure. We might be taking over here in the West 2 steps forward, but then go 1 step back. So that those figures that are mentioned here, 2050, may still be really sort of just maybe good wishes, perhaps. Now, this is the way we are going to be heading towards solar power and then batteries to preserve that energy, so to be used later. Now, this is the CO2 emission, USA and China. The blue line is USA, and China is this one. As you can see, if you look at this figure here, 1950 here, I think it is. Let me make it this bit bigger. 1950, China was really level here, zero practically. And of course, USA was polluting very, very heavily. But then when China became part of the growth and became part of the WTO in the 80s and 90s, I think, it exploded. And you can see this is the explosion. It became the manufacturer of goods for the whole world. And they're using the energy that they use is all coal practically. So that's why we have China investing. It says 277 billion to curb air pollution state. So they are very worried themselves that they have problems as far as the pollution is concerned, and they're going to spend big bucks on that. And here at Paris Agreement is saying by 2030, peak, the emissions will peak, and after that, just start to go down. Now, this is the Trump basically saying, don't believe in climate change and so on. It's a hoax, he says. And there were protests in USA, thankfully, but then, of course, a lot of people still follow him. Now, this is a picture of the polar region. As you can see, it's all sort of snowed up, it's ice here. But then as the global warming takes place, all the polar ice is gone. So you can see all these islands here. Now, China is undertaking plans, as I said, to try and curb this emission, and their plans of electric cars. In fact, China is the country with the most electric vehicles in the world now. Although Tesla is there in USA, the capacity, they're building enormous factories still, but they're not sort of doing it fast enough. Although they're the biggest EV sort of manufacturers in USA, in fact, in the world, yet they're not moving fast enough, because if you look at what's happening in Giga Berlin, they're building a big factory to make maybe up to 2 to 3 million cars a year, sooner or later. But this auto lobby, Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, what have you, they're trying to put the brakes on. And therefore, there are lots of objections to the factory coming in Guderheide near Berlin. So really, you can see the baddies are at work. You know, there were the baddies at one time when the railroads were being built in USA. They stopped the oil companies and the automobile companies. They stopped the railroads being built because they wanted, roads to be built, highways, and they wanted oil to be used. And of course, you can see that's why you've got an automobile type of society in USA, causing all this pollution using oil. Now, in China, they already have these electric buses, and they've got cars as well, which are greatest number. In fact, Tesla has a car factory in Shanghai. They're building about close to 500,000 cars every year in that factory. And in fact, Elon Musk has been the only company that the Chinese have allowed to come in without having a local Chinese partner, so that they can go full speed ahead and bring in their electric cars. So they're serious when they talk about bringing in EVs into the country. Now, here's a picture of, again, a global picture as to where we are in terms of renewable energies that are being used. In USA, this is a figure of 2019, 11% of energy used is renewable. In EU, it's 18, and in China is 13. That's in 2019. And of course, when we see this is 2030, they want to move it up to 20% of the energy to be renewable. So they've got very, very distinct plans how they want to change. Now, this is a picture to say where they are at the moment. As you can see, this red part here tells you how polluting they are because they use coal. Enormous amount. And the reason I said they started to use coal was that that's the only energy available to them when the global market opened up for them and when they got into the WTO. So they had orders galore. Western direct investment came in because factories started to be built and cheap products were made and then shipped back to the USA and to the West. And therefore, of course, China rode on that sort of success, building up their exports, but they started to use coal. And now they're going to have to start moving in here by bringing about the change. So most of this red thing has got to disappear. And one of the things we need to watch at this COP26 next in November is to see how committed they are to removing the coal that is polluting their country and the world, enormously. So here, China relaxes on coal power expansion for third year running. Here again, China is being ruled by demand of having to export and better the economic well-being. So they loosen the restrictions, which is a bad thing, of course. This is the coal consumption in China. As you can start, it started to go up again when they loosen these restrictions. Now, this is the coal industries, how they are at the moment standing. In China, they produce about 250 gigawatts of energy. We can just be interested in relative figures because these figures are so big, we don't know what it actually means. But actually, giga means 1,000 million watts, so it's 250,000 megawatts. So anyway, so China, USA is not too far behind. India is also polluting in a big way. Okay, this is again saying they want to achieve CO2 emission peak. We said this before, by 2060, become. And of course, the neighboring countries, South Korea and Japan, are also taking the lead from China, and they want to become carbon neutral. Yeah, again, USA also deprioritized climate when Trump was there, but I think Biden is sort of reversing that. Now, what we are saying here is the US and it doesn't need the world doesn't need USA to lead. What has happened is China has started to take the lead when Trump was not part of the agreement. And here we see Paris Agreement, of course. That was the target there. Reduce emissions by 26 to 28% below 25 levels. Now, these figures don't mean too much. What we have got to sort of say is whether we are going to meet that 1.5 to 2% target. So here it's not sufficient, basically the agreement of Paris. So COP26 agreements will be far, far, far more important. Now, this is really a relative sort of picture that we can see where we are. See, what we want to be doing is 1.5% increase. Now, 1.5% increase is down here. This is 2%, this is 1.5, the yellow band. So, and we are here. Now, our pledges at the moment, right now, will take us to this 2.8 increase in climate. And with the current policies, it might be even 3% increase. Optimistic policies, 2.8. So we need to do a lot better than this to be able to be in this band. So that's why COP26 is so important. Now, this to tell you, these two countries, China and USA, they are 40% of the global GDP. So you can see just under half. And they're also responsible for just under half of the global emissions. So you can see why these two countries have got to work together on climate to be able to sort of do anything, substantively meaningful. This is again saying the same thing. By 2050, we need to have zero. And if we don't take action, this is what we're going to be seeing. Lots of pollution in the thing there. It is going to be detrimental to our health. Polar thing melting, lots of flooding all over the place, droughts in other places, fires in other places. We have so much about it, of global warming. So really quite. And now let's look at the EU. EU is also sort of, when the new president came about, she came up with a green policy, and that's very encouraging. Yeah, she's announcing that European Commission led by Ursula von der Leyen. And they are saying they're going to sort of prioritize ensuring low carbon neutrality goal by 2050. So they're also sort of looking at 2050 as having to reduce the total European emissions in a big way. So EU climate neutrality. Neutrality means zero carbon neutral. It's zero emissions in a way, globally. Because although all the factories may not sort of become totally free of carbon emission, but there may be others who are less than what is required. So by balancing the two, we might get something which is enough. So they're producing a fair amount of money as well, 1 trillion euros. So they're putting their energy in and plans. So that's all I will say for the moment. And since you're not there because of this dry run, no Q&A today. All right. Thank you for listening, and bye.